Hello, New York Giants fans, and welcome to Everything New York Giants. I'm your host, Adriana, a longtime Giants fan who is such a diehard fan. I even created a separate Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter to talk all about the New York Giants. So you might know me from there as New York Giants fangirl. And if you don't, you can follow me on those platforms where, just like in this podcast, I talk about everything New York Giants. So, the reason I wanted to go ahead and start a podcast outside of the social channels is obviously with a platform like Instagram and TikTok, I can't go as in depth as I would like to because there's always so much that we can talk about when it comes to the Giants, especially in the last 6 months when we've got a whole new staff. We've got a ton of draft picks and a lot of guys that have been brought in to try and get this team to win. So let's cover off on what you can expect as a listener from Everything New York Giants. So these will be the topics that we will cover off on week after week. So let's start with a deep dive into the history of the Giants. The franchise is almost 100 years old, and obviously with that comes a lot of experience, history, good, bad, and a lot of championships. So we'll cover off on superstar players. That includes guys like Lawrence Taylor. We'll talk about the Ring of Honor participants. We'll talk about coaches, and we'll talk about those championships because obviously we can't talk about the Giants without Super Bowls 42 and 46. But now that's in the past. Let's talk about the present. So, obviously, with the season coming up, there is going to be a lot to talk about. So, we are going to focus on the present, which is going to include all sorts of updates with the team. We'll talk about the current players on the roster. We'll talk about a lot of the roster turnover that's going to happen week after week throughout the season. We'll talk about contracts, what those are going to look like, how we're doing against the salary cap, injuries, and more. I will also be providing weekly updates. So in the off season, that will look like a recap of OTAs, training camps, and then during the regular season, it will be pregame specials and postgame specials. So let's talk about the pregame specials because the Bengals game is right around the corner. So pregame specials will include things like what to look for each week. So for example, this week with the Bengals coming up, we will look at how the ones are looking. We're going to see what kind of wide receivers get put in with the ones. Will that include Darius Slayton? Will it include Colin Johnson, Richie James? We'll talk about the running backs. There's quite a few guys on the roster who are pretty impressive, and we'll see which ones are going to get played with the ones. So we'll dive really deep into that. There's obviously going to be a lot to talk about in the pregame. And also what the Giants need to do to win, whether it's pregame or it's regular, or whether it's preseason or the regular season. There are things that this team needs to do to prepare each week against their opponent to win the game. So we'll cover off on that. Now let's talk about the post game because hopefully they do win quite a few games more than last year and we can cover off on the good stuff. So we'll talk about the highlights, what players played well, how the overall offense looked and the defense. What were the highlights of the game? The good stuff that we want to talk about, especially when it comes to wins. When it comes to losses, there will be some good stuff to talk about, but obviously we need to talk about what they need to improve on. So that will be a topic of discussion in our post-game recaps. Finally, because I am such a fantasy nut, I'm the commissioner of my team, and you can bet your butt that I am reading all the websites. I am checking the Stardom Situm every week. When the regular season starts, I am on it. So I've won my fantasy league a couple times. I need to do it again this year. So each week during the season, I'll cover specific Giants players to watch for. You might want to think about adding someone like Shepard or KT or Wan'Dale Robinson as your flex wide receiver. Or if the Giants defense is looking pretty good and Wink's blitzing scheme is working out, you might want to start them when they're playing the Lions. So keep that in mind. We'll cover off on all fantasy stuff as the season progresses. So stay tuned for all of that. That about covers it. That will be what the Everything New York Giants podcast will sound like to you. I will also do Q&As, so you can submit your questions on my Instagram at New York Giants Fangirl. And I will also have co-hosts and guests. So I will also do the Q&As for them so you guys can ask away. And hopefully we can get some former and current players in here so we can get a deeper dive into the Giants, what it's like being a player or a worker there, and how things are. So get excited for all of that stuff coming up. Before I want to sign off, I want to answer a question that I get asked quite often across my social channels. And that is, how did I end up being a Giants fan? So I grew up in New Jersey, and what I have loved about all of talking to all of you New York Giants fans is that you didn't have to grow up in the tri-state area like I did to be a Giants fan. I know fans who live in Australia, Scotland, Mexico. They live all over the US and outside of the US, which is pretty amazing. But for me, I grew up in the tri-state. My grandfather was a diehard Giants fan. He had season tickets up until when they got rid of Giants Stadium and moved over to MetLife. He was at every single game, and when he wasn't at the games, he was watching every game. I think in his 83 years, he never missed a single game. So you guys think I'm diehard. I hope to continue to watch every single game until I'm 83 as well. I have some of his gear, one of my favorites being a Lawrence Taylor jersey, which I love. So the Giants love got passed early on. My whole family, I have 3 brothers, my parents, we are all Giants fans. Some of us a little bit more than others, but we all root for them. They are our home team, and they are who we love and support, whether they are 4-13 or they're going to the Super Bowl. So New York Giants fans are diehard fans. We are there through the good and the bad. And that pretty much sums up how I ended up being a fan. So now that I live in Connecticut, I am making sure that all of the locals know that I am a Giants fan. I am not a Pats fan, even though I don't live in New York or New Jersey. So I hope you guys enjoy the episode. Thank you for listening. You can subscribe to Everything New York Giants on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. Thanks for listening, and feel free to share with a friend.